If you leave, don't come back. The words hit harder than expected, not because they were loud, but because they came from the woman she had served for years, spoken with the calm cruelty of someone who had never been told no. In the center of an opulent mansion filled with brunch guests in silk and gold, a young black maid stood trembling, her eyes downcast, one hand gently held by the little girl she had helped raise. Her mother had just died. She had asked quietly and respectfully for 2 days to attend the funeral, but her request was met with mockery, not sympathy. Laughter spilled from the guests like wine on linen, careless and staining. For years, she had ironed clothes, calmed tantrums, scrubbed floors until they shone, and endured insults that sliced deeper than any reprimand. Her name was rarely spoken. Her presence was expected, but never acknowledged. Her grief, like her life, was meant to remain invisible, but something inside her shifted. A stillness gave way to something steady and sharp. This was more than a moment of heartbreak. It was the beginning of a quiet reckoning. What happens when someone the world refuses to see finally chooses to be seen? The air in the Sinclair mansion hung heavy with the scent of polished mahogany and lavender wax, a sterile perfume that clung to every surface. Teresa Carter, a 29-year-old black woman, moved through the pre-dawn silence, her footsteps muffled on the cold marble floors. The grand chandelier above the foyer glimmered faintly, its crystals catching the first slivers of light, creeping through the tall, arched windows. For 3 years, Teresa had risen before the sun, her body attuned to the rhythm of this opulent prison. Her hands, calloused yet precise, tied the crisp white apron around her waist, the fabric starched to a stiffness that mirrored the house itself. She was the maid, the invisible force that kept the estate immaculate. Yet to the Sinclairs, she was merely the help, a title that stripped her of her name, her humanity. Teresa's days began in the kitchen, a cavernous space of gleaming steel and imported tile. She filled the kettle, its whistle a familiar prelude to the morning's demands. The antique porcelain cups, delicate as eggshells, sat in neat rows, waiting for her to arrange them on a silver tray. She worked with the grace of habit, her movements fluid despite the ache in her shoulders from yesterday's endless scrubbing. The mansion demanded perfection, floors without a speck of dust, linens folded with military precision, and not a single smudge on the crystal stemware. Teresa delivered, though her efforts went unnoticed. To Evelyn Sinclair, the white matriarch, who ruled this domain, Teresa's labor was expected, her presence incidental. The first rays of dawn painted the sky a soft pink, filtering through the windows to illuminate the dining room's heavy oak table. Teresa set of platters of warm croissants and fresh fruit, her hands steady even as her mind wandered. She thought of her mother, Clara, whose laughter once filled a cramped but warm kitchen far from this sterile palace. Clara's voice, rich with song, had taught Teresa resilience, but here in this house that resilience felt like surrender. For 3 years she had polished, dusted, and served, her dreams tucked away like linens in a drawer. She was 29, yet the weight of her work made her feel decades older. As the household stirred, Teresa glided through her tasks, a shadow among the mansion's grandeur. The walls, adorned with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, seemed to watch her. The rugs, thick and imported, swallowed the sound of her steps as if the house itself demanded her silence. She adjusted the cushions, straightened the frames, and wiped down the surfaces, her presence as unobtrusive as the morning mist. But the silence was not peaceful. It was a cage, one she had learned to navigate without complaint. In the nursery, Teresa paused to tend to Lily, the Sinclairs' 8-year-old daughter. Lily's room was a pastel haven, cluttered with dolls and books. The girl's dark curls spilled over her pillow as she stirred, her eyes bright with the innocence Teresa envied. "Tell me a story," Lily whispered, clutching a worn teddy. Bear she called Mr. Chubby. Teresa hesitated, glancing at the clock. Her duties awaited, but Lily's pleading gaze softened her resolve. "Just a short one," Teresa said, her voice low. She spun a tale of a woman who danced through storms, a story Clara had told her as a child, about courage woven into hardship. Lily's smile was a rare warmth in Teresa's day, a flicker of connection in a house that thrived on detachment. The moment was shattered when Evelyn's voice cut through the hallway. "Girl, the breakfast table isn't going to set itself." The word girl stung, a deliberate slight that reduced Teresa to a role, not a person. She hurried back to the dining room, her heart sinking as Lily's soft humming faded behind her. Evelyn stood at the table, her silk robe pristine, her blonde hair pulled into a flawless chignon. She inspected the silverware, her lips pursing at an imagined flaw. "This fork is smudged," she said, her tone clipped. "Do it again." Teresa nodded, her jaw tight, and polished the fork until it gleamed. Evelyn didn't look up from her phone, dismissing Teresa with a wave. The morning unfolded in a blur of tasks. Teresa ironed tablecloths, scrubbed baseboards, and carried trays of coffee to the parlor where Evelyn entertained her society friends. Their laughter, sharp and careless, filled the room as they discussed charity galas and vacation homes. Teresa stood by the wall, her hands clasped, her face a mask of neutrality. She had learned to absorb their casual disdain, the way they ignored her, the way they spoke of the help as if she weren't there. Once, she had hoped for a kind word, a nod of acknowledgement. Now she expected nothing but the weight of their indifference. As noon approached, Teresa retreated to the kitchen to prepare lunch. The air smelled of lemon oil and fresh herbs, a fleeting comfort. She sliced tomatoes with precision, her knife moving in rhythm with her thoughts. She remembered Clara's kitchen, where the scent of cornbread and sage had been a promise of love. Here, the food she'd prepared was consumed without gratitude. The plates were returned with scraps she'd later scrape into the bin. Her life was a cycle of service, her worth measured by the shine of the mansion's surfaces. The afternoon brought a rare moment of quiet. Teresa slipped into the nursery again, finding Lily drawing at her small desk. "Look," Lily said, holding up a sketch of a garden with two stick figures holding hands. "It's us." Teresa's heart ached at the sight, a reminder of what she could never fully have here, a connection, a place. She smiled, tucking a curl behind Lily's ear. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft. But the sound of Evelyn's heels clicking down the hall ended the moment. "Don't dawdle," Evelyn snapped from the doorway, her eyes narrowing. "You're not here to play." Teresa returned to her duties, the rebuke settling like dust. Her chest. She polished the grand staircase, her reflection distorted in the brass railing. The mansion, with its imported stone and towering ceilings, felt like a monument to her erasure. She was indispensable yet invisible, her labor the backbone of this household, her existence a footnote. The ache in her shoulders spread to her heart, a quiet grief for the woman she might have been. As dusk fell, Teresa retreated to her quarters, a converted shed behind the mansion, its walls peeling, its single window offering a view of the manicured lawn. The space was hers only. In name, a place to rest but never to belong. She sat on the creaking cot, her hands tracing the frame of a faded photograph of Clara, her mother's smile a beacon in the dim light. The day's humiliations replayed in her mind, Evelyn's sharp words, the guests' laughter, the weight of being unseen. Yet in Lily's small gestures there was a spark of something else, a reminder of Clara's stories about strength. Teresa lay down, the cot groaning under her weight. The mansion loomed beyond her window, its lights glowing like a distant city. She closed her eyes, hearing Lily's faint humming from earlier, a melody Clara had taught her. It was a fragile thread, tying her to a past she could barely hold. Tomorrow she would rise again, don the apron, and fade into the shadows of the Sinclair estate. But tonight, in the quiet of her shed, Teresa whispered a promise to herself. She would not disappear entirely. The shed where Teresa Carter slept was a world apart from the Sinclair mansion's grandeur, its walls whispering of neglect within every creak. A single bulb cast a feeble glow over the peeling paint, and the air held a damp chill that seeped into her bones. It was well past midnight, the estate silent save for the distant hum of crickets. Teresa knelt by the cot, her fingers tracing a loose floorboard she'd noticed weeks ago, its edge curling upward like a secret begging to be told. She'd ignored it until tonight, when exhaustion and a restless ache drove her to pry it open. Beneath, tucked in a hollowed-out space, lay a small, leather-bound diary, its cover worn to a soft sheen, the name Sarah etched faintly on the inside flap. Teresa's breath caught as she lifted the book, dust motes swirling in the dim light. She settled cross-legged on the floor, her back against the cot, and opened it with care. The pages, yellowed and brittle, held a tight, slanted script that spoke of a woman who'd once walked these same halls. Sarah, another maid, had poured her life into these words, her days of scrubbing, folding, and serving, her nights of quiet despair. "They don't see us," one entry read, dated a decade earlier. "We're the hands that make their world shine, but to them, we're nothing." Teresa's heart thudded, each sentence a mirror to her existence. Sarah wrote of Evelyn's cold demands, of insults veiled as instructions, of a life reduced to tasks and silence. As Teresa read, her fingers trembled. Sarah described moments that felt stolen from Teresa's days. Evelyn checking her bag for theft, a ritual that left Teresa burning with shame. Sharp words when a glass wasn't spotless, the expectation to be ever present yet invisible. One passage struck her like a blow. "They don't see us, but we see everything. Their lies, their cruelty, their fragile pride." The words burrowed into Teresa, stirring something long buried. She closed the diary, her chest tight, and reached for a small notebook she kept on her nightstand. It was a cheap thing, bought on a whim, its pages mostly blank. Tonight she felt compelled to write, her pen scratching out fragmented thoughts. "I'm tired of disappearing. I'm more than their hands." The next morning, Teresa moved through her duties with a new awareness, the diary's words echoing in her mind. She polished the dining room chandelier, its crystals winking like stars, but her thoughts were on Sarah, on the weight of a shared invisibility. The mansion's opulence, marble counters, silk drapes, gold-framed mirrors, felt like a stage for someone else's story, one where Teresa was a prop. Evelyn's voice broke her reverie, calling from the parlor. "Hurry with the tea, girl." The word girl landed like a slap, but Teresa's face remained a mask as she prepared the tray, her hands steady despite the fire in her chest. In the nursery, Teresa found a brief respite. Lily, the Sinclair's 8-year-old, was sprawled on the rug, sketching with crayons. "Look," Lily said, holding up a drawing of a garden, two stick figures hand in hand under a bright sun. "It's you and me." Teresa's throat tightened. The innocence in Lily's eyes was a rare balm, a reminder of the stories her mother, Clara, had told her about women who found light in darkness. "It's perfect," Teresa murmured, her fingers brushing the paper. But the moment fractured. When Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her expression sharp. "You're not paid to draw," she snapped, snatching the sketch and tearing it in two. "Lily, you know better. She's the help, not your friend." Lily's eyes welled and Teresa's heart sank, but she said nothing, retreating to the kitchen with the pieces of the drawing burning in her memory. The day wore on, each task a reminder of Sarah's diary. Teresa dusted the library's towering shelves, the scent of old books mingling with wax polish. She carried linens to the laundry, their crisp folds a testament to her unseen labor. Evelyn's friends arrived for lunch, their chatter filling the house with a careless hum. Teresa served them, her presence a shadow they barely acknowledged. One woman, adjusting her pearl necklace, remarked, "The help these days don't know their place." Evelyn's laugh was a blade, and Teresa felt it slice through her, though she kept her gaze lowered, her hands busy with plates. That evening, back in the shed, Teresa opened her notebook again. The diary's influence was undeniable, urging her to name her pain. She wrote of the bag checks, the insults, the way Evelyn's eyes slid past her as if she were furniture. "I'm not nothing," she scrawled, her handwriting fierce. "I'm Teresa Carter." The act of writing felt like defiance, a small rebellion against the mansion's suffocating rules. She tucked Sarah's diary back under the floorboard, its weight a promise she wasn't ready to fully grasp. The next day brought a fresh indignity. Evelyn summoned Teresa to the foyer, her tone icy. "My guests noticed a stain on the tablecloth yesterday. Careless work reflects poorly on me." Teresa knew there was no stain. She'd checked every inch, but she nodded, murmuring an apology. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, and she added, "I'll be checking your bag later. We can't be too careful." The accusation stung, a reminder of Sarah's words about theft checks, a ritual designed to humiliate. Teresa's hands clenched, but she forced them to relax, returning to her tasks with a quiet fury. In the quiet of the nursery, Lily approached Teresa again, her voice small. "I'm sorry about the picture," she whispered, clutching Mr. Chubby, her teddy bear. Teresa knelt, her smile strained but genuine. "It's okay, sweetheart. We'll draw another one someday." Lily's nod was tentative, her eyes searching Teresa's for reassurance. The moment was a lifeline, a flicker of connection in a house that thrived on division. As night fell, Teresa sat in her shed, the diary's words haunting her. She opened her notebook, writing. Sarah saw them too, their cruelty, their lies. "I see it now." The pen felt heavy, each word a step toward something she couldn't yet name. She looked at Clara's photograph on her nightstand, her mother's smile a beacon in the gloom. The mansion loomed beyond her window, its lights cold and distant. Teresa closed her notebook, her resolve hardening. She would not let her story end like Sarah's, forgotten beneath the floorboards. Tomorrow she would face the mansion's demands again. But tonight, she held on to the truth that she was more than their shadow. The Sinclair mansion hummed with its usual morning cadence, a symphony of clinking china and murmured orders. "Teresa." Carter moved through the kitchen, her hands deftly arranging a tray of pastries, the buttery scent mingling with the sharp tang of fresh coffee. The dawn light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble counters. At 29, Teresa's body knew the rhythm of this place, its demands, its silences. But today, a quiet unease stirred within her, Sarah's diary still lingering in her thoughts. She pushed it aside, focusing on the tasks that anchored her. Slicing fruit, setting out crystal glasses, ensuring every detail met Evelyn Sinclair's exacting standards. Yet beneath her practiced calm, a thread of restlessness tugged, as if the air itself held a warning. As Teresa carried the tray to the dining room, her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, a rare intrusion. She glanced around, ensuring Evelyn was nowhere near, and slipped into the pantry to answer. Her sister Marla's voice came through, thin and fractured like glass about to shatter. "Teresa, it's Mama. She's gone. Stroke. Last night." The words landed like stones, heavy and unyielding, sinking into Teresa's chest. She gripped the edge of a shelf, her breath shallow, as Marla's voice broke into a sob. She was fine yesterday, laughing in the kitchen. Then she just collapsed. Teresa's mind reeled, unable to anchor the news. Clara, her mother, with her warm hands and songs, was gone. It felt impossible, a theft too vast to comprehend. Teresa stood frozen, the pantry's shelves blurring before her. She saw Clara's kitchen in her mind's eye, cramped, worn, but alive with love. The memory of cornbread baking, its golden crust filling the air with comfort, flooded her senses. Clara's voice, rich with folk songs about women who defied the odds, had been Teresa's compass. She remembered mornings spent kneading dough together, Clara's laughter a melody that made even the hardest days bearable. Now that kitchen was silent, its warmth extinguished. Teresa's fingers tightened around the phone, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll come home, Marla. I'll be there." Back in the kitchen, Teresa tried to steady herself, her hands trembling as she arranged napkins. She needed to ask Evelyn for 2 days off to attend Clara's funeral. The thought of facing her employer, with her cold gaze and sharper tongue, knotted Teresa's stomach, but she had no choice. Clara deserved a proper goodbye, and Teresa would not let this house steal that from her. She moved through her morning tasks on instinct, polishing silverware, refilling coffee, her mind tethered to memories of her mother's smile, her calloused hands stirring a pot, her voice saying, "You're my light, Teresa. Don't let anyone dim it." At noon, Evelyn hosted a brunch in the sunlit conservatory, its glass walls framing a manicured garden. The guests, draped in designer dresses, sipped mimosas and chatted about charity events. Teresa approached, her apron pristine, her heart pounding. She waited until Evelyn paused, then spoke softly. "Ma'am, I need to ask for 2 days off. My mother passed away last night. I need to go home for her funeral." The words felt raw, exposing a wound she could barely name. The room fell quiet, the guest's eyes flicking toward her, then away. Evelyn set down her glass, her lips curling into a dismissive smile. "Your people always have drama," she said, her voice carrying a practiced lilt that made the guests chuckle. "If every maid left for a funeral, who'd clean this place?" Laughter erupted, sharp and cruel, slicing through Teresa like a blade. She stood rooted, her face burning, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. The guests resumed their chatter, as if her grief were a minor inconvenience, a spill to be wiped away. Evelyn waved her off. "Back to work, we'll manage. Without you. But don't expect special treatment." Teresa retreated to the kitchen, her vision blurring with unshed tears. The laughter echoed in her ears, each note a reminder of her place in this house. Essential, yet expendable. She leaned against the counter, her fingers tracing the edge of a mixing bowl. She wanted to recreate Clara's cornbread to summon her mother's warmth, but her hands shook too much. The flour spilled, dusting the counter like ash. She sank to the floor, clutching Clara's photograph from her pocket, her mother's smile a faint light in the storm of her grief. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I should have been there." The rest of the day passed in a haze. Teresa served lunch, cleared plates, and swept the floors, her movements mechanical. The guests' voices drifted through the house, carefree and distant, while her heart screamed. She thought of Clara's songs, the way her mother had taught her to stand tall even when the world pushed her down. But here, in this mansion, standing tall felt impossible. Evelyn's words had stripped her bare, reducing her loss to a punchline. Teresa's grief was a weight she carried alone, unnoticed by the house that demanded her labor, but not her humanity. As evening fell, Teresa stood in the pantry again, staring at the spilled flour. She tried to make Clara's cornbread, hoping the familiar act would anchor her, but the dough wouldn't hold, crumbling under her trembling fingers. She abandoned it, the mess a mirror of her fractured spirit. She returned to her shed, the night air cool against her skin. Sitting on the cot, she opened her notebook, the one she'd begun writing in after finding Sarah's diary. Her pen hovered, then pressed to the page. "They laughed at my pain," she wrote, her script jagged. "Mama's gone and they laughed." The words felt like a confession, a release, but also a wound laid bare. Teresa looked at Clara's photograph, her mother's eyes steady and kind. "You told me I'm light," she murmured, "but I'm fading here." The mansion loomed outside, its windows glowing with a warmth that never reached her. She closed her notebook, her grief a heavy companion. Tomorrow, she would face Evelyn. Again, her request unanswered, her loss unacknowledged. But tonight, in the quiet of her shed, Teresa held on to Clara's memory, a flicker of strength in the darkness. She wasn't ready to fight, not yet, but the seed of defiance, planted by Sarah's words and nurtured by her mother's love, was beginning to stir. The Sinclair mansion slumbered under a moonless sky, its grand silhouette a monolith against the stars. Inside the shed, Teresa Carter sat on her creaking cot, the weight of her mother's death a stone in her chest. The night was still, save for the faint rustle of leaves beyond her small window. Clara's photograph lay beside her, its edges worn from her touch, her mother's smile a quiet rebuke to the day's cruelty. Teresa's grief had hardened into something else, a resolve sparked by Sarah's diary, its words echoing in her mind. Don't let them take your voice. She opened her notebook, her pen trembling as she wrote, They laughed at Mama's death. I won't let them erase me too. The act of writing felt like a spark in the dark, a defiance she could no longer suppress. Teresa rose, her movements deliberate. She pulled Sarah's diary from its hiding place beneath the floorboard, its leather cover cool against her palm. The pages whispered of a woman who'd endured the same indignities, and one line burned in her memory. We see everything. Teresa's eyes drifted to the mansion, its lights dimmed, its occupants oblivious. She would leave, she decided, but not without a mark. In the kitchen, where moonlight spilled across the counters, Teresa approached Evelyn's prized porcelain collection, displayed in a glass cabinet. The plates, delicate and hand-painted, were Evelyn's pride, a symbol of her untouchable status. Teresa rearranged them, tilting each just slightly off-center, a subtle act of rebellion, invisible to all but Evelyn's meticulous eye. It was her first step toward reclaiming her voice. By 4 a.m., Teresa had packed a small duffel bag with her few possessions, a change of clothes, her notebook, Clara's photograph, and the bracelet Marla had given her, engraved with light. She slipped out of the shed, the gravel crunching softly under her worn shoes. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-soaked grass. She paused at the back gate, glancing at the mansion one last time. Its grandeur felt hollow now, a facade, hiding its cruelty. Teresa boarded the first bus south, its engine rumbling as the estate faded into the pre-dawn haze. She clutched her bag, the bracelet glinting on her wrist, a reminder of Clara's words, "You're my light." The journey to her hometown was a blur of gray highways and fleeting towns. Teresa stared out the window, her mind heavy with memories of Clara's kitchen, the clatter of pots, the warmth of cornbread, the lilt of folk songs that had shaped her childhood. When the bus stopped at a dusty station, the air smelled of earth and memory. She walked to her family's small house, its paint chipped but familiar. The kitchen was silent, the stove cold where Clara once stood, singing as she cooked. Teresa tried to make her mother's cornbread, her hands moving through the motions, but the dough crumbled, the recipe incomplete without Clara's touch. She sank to the floor, tears falling as she whispered, "I'm here, Mama. I'm too weak, but I'm here." The funeral was held the next day in a modest church, its pews filled with neighbors and kin. The air carried the scent of lilies and wax, and the congregation sang Clara's favorite folk songs, their voices weaving a tapestry of grief and love. Marla stood beside Teresa, pressing the bracelet into her hand. "She wore this every day," Marla said, her voice thick. "She'd want you to have it." Teresa traced the word light, its weight grounding her as the preacher spoke of Clara's kindness, her laughter, her strength. Teresa clung to the bracelet, its metal warm. Against her skin, a tether to her mother's spirit. She didn't speak, but her presence was a promise to honor Clara's memory. 2 days later, Teresa returned to the Sinclair estate, her heart heavy but resolute. The bus ride back had been quiet, the bracelet a constant on her wrist. She approached the back gate, expecting to slip back into her routine, but found it locked, a heavy chain glinting in the morning light. Her breath caught as she circled to the rear lawn, where her belongings lay scattered in black trash bags, sodden from an overnight rain. Among them was Mr. Chubby, the teddy bear Lily had given her, its fur matted and stained. Teresa knelt, her fingers brushing the bear, her chest tightening with betrayal. No note, no explanation, only this final dismissal, as if her 3 years of labor meant nothing. Teresa gathered her things, the wet bags heavy in her arms. The bracelet glinted, a reminder of Clara's words, but the sting of Evelyn's rejection burned. She thought of Sarah's diary, of the women who'd come before her, their voices silenced by this house. She would not let hers be next. With Mr. Chubby tucked under her arm, Teresa walked away, the mansion's shadow shrinking behind her. She boarded another bus, this time to nowhere certain, her heart a storm of grief and defiance. The city blurred past, its lights flickering like promises she couldn't yet name. As the bus rumbled on, Teresa opened her notebook, her pen moving with purpose. "They threw me out like garbage," she wrote, "but I'm not theirs to discard. Mama taught me better." The words felt like a vow, each stroke a step away from the mansion's grip. She thought of Lily, her small face bright with stories, and hoped the girl would one day understand. The bracelet caught the light, its inscription a quiet fire in her soul. Teresa didn't know where she'd go next, but she knew she'd never return to that shed, that life. The bus stopped at a small station, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked pavement. Teresa stepped off, her duffel slung over her shoulder, Mr. Chubby peeking out. She stood for a moment, the world vast and uncertain before her. Clara's voice echoed in her mind, a folk song about a woman who walked through fire and emerged whole. Teresa's fingers tightened around the bracelet, its weight a reminder that she carried her mother's light. She would find a place to rest, to grieve, to rebuild. The mansion was behind her now, its porcelain plates askew, its cruelty exposed by her quiet rebellion. Teresa took a step forward, her heart steady, her future unwritten, but her own. The city's edges blurred into a quiet sprawl as Teresa Carter stepped off the bus, her duffel bag heavy with the remnants of her life. The late afternoon air carried the scent of wet asphalt and distant pines, a stark contrast to the sterile polish of the Sinclair mansion. Her mother's bracelet, engraved with light, glinted on her wrist, a steady anchor amidst her grief. With nowhere else to turn, Teresa followed a whispered memory from her childhood. A small church on the outskirts of town, known for sheltering those cast aside. Her shoes, still damp from the rain-soaked lawn where her belongings had been, discarded, crunched against the gravel path leading to the weathered wooden doors of the old church. Its steeple leaned slightly, a testament to years of storms, yet it stood resolute, a beacon in the fading light. Inside, the air was warm, tinged with the scent of candle wax and old hymnals. Teresa paused in the vestibule, her eyes adjusting to the dim glow of flickering votives. The pews were worn, their wood polished by decades of hands seeking solace. A tall man with graying hair and kind eyes approached. Pastor Calvin, his presence calm yet commanding. "You look like you need a place to rest," he said, his voice soft but steady. Teresa nodded, her throat tight, clutching Mr. Chubby, the sodden teddy bear, as if it could hold her together. Calvin led her to a small room off the sanctuary, furnished with a cot and a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender. "This is home, for now," he said, leaving her with a gentle nod. Teresa sank onto the cot, the weight of Clara's death and Evelyn's betrayal pressing against her ribs. She set her bag down, the bracelet catching the light as she unpacked her notebook and her mother's photograph. The church's quiet was a balm, unlike the oppressive silence of the mansion. Here, the walls seemed to listen rather than judge. As night fell, Teresa met Ruth, a wiry woman in her 60s with eyes that held both fire and sorrow. Ruth, a volunteer and former maid, moved with the quiet strength of someone who'd carried her burdens. Over a cup of bitter coffee, Ruth shared her story. Decades spent serving families who saw her as less than human, her dreams buried under their demands. "I wrote to myself to survive," Ruth said, her voice low. "Put your pain on paper, Teresa. It'll hold you when nothing else does." Inspired, Teresa opened her notebook that night, the church's silence wrapping around her like a shield. Under the glow of a single lamp, she began to write what would become the letter. From the backyard, her pen moved haltingly at first, tracing the contours of her grief. Clara's sudden death, the laughter that had mocked her loss, the trash bags holding her life. "They called me the help," she wrote, her script sharp with anger. "They laughed when I begged to bury my mother, but I'm not their shadow. Each word carved a space for her pain, transforming it from a weight to a weapon. She wrote of the mansion's cold elegance, of Evelyn's sneers, of the years she'd spent erasing herself to fit their world. The letter was raw, unpolished, a cry from a heart too long silenced. By morning, Teresa felt lighter, as if the act of writing had loosened a knot within her. She joined Ruth in the church's small kitchen, where they prepared breakfast for a handful of women, laborers, mothers, survivors who sought refuge here. Their faces, lined with exhaustion, mirrored Teresa's own. Ruth watched her closely, her gaze knowing. "You've got something to say," Ruth said, handing her a plate of toast. "Don't stop now." Teresa nodded, her resolve strengthening. That afternoon, she slipped into the church's back room, where a bulletin board hung, covered with flyers and prayers. Without a signature, she pinned her letter there, its pages trembling in the draft. It was a quiet act, yet it felt monumental, like shouting into a void that might finally answer. As days passed, Teresa settled into the church's rhythm, helping Ruth serve meals and mend clothes. The women shared stories of their own, jobs lost, dignity stolen, lives spent in service to others' comfort. Teresa listened, her heart aching with recognition. One evening, a young woman named Maya, barely 20, wandered into the church, her eyes wide with curiosity. She lingered by the bulletin board, reading Teresa's letter with a furrowed brow. Unbeknownst to Teresa, Maya snapped a photo with her phone, her fingers quick as she uploaded it to an online forum for domestic workers. The letter, raw and unnamed, began its journey beyond the church's walls, a spark in a world ready to ignite. Teresa spent her nights writing more, her notebook filling with fragments of her truth. She wrote of Clara's songs, of the bracelet that kept her mother close, of the teddy bear that held Lily's fleeting kindness. Ruth sat with her sometimes, offering quiet encouragement. "Your words are powerful," Ruth said one night, her voice steady. "They'll find who needs them." Teresa wasn't sure she believed that, but the act of writing kept her grounded, a tether to the woman she was becoming. By the week's end, the church felt less like a refuge and more like a home. Teresa helped Pastor Calvin organize donations, her hands steady as she folded blankets and sorted canned goods. The bracelet gleamed on her wrist, a reminder of Clara's light. She thought of Sarah's diary, its words urging her forward, and of her letter, now pinned to the board like a prayer. She didn't know Maya's photo had spread, that her words were reaching strangers, stirring hearts. All she knew was the quiet strength growing within her, a fire kindled by grief and fanned by truth. As she lay on the cot, the church's walls, humming with the soft sounds of shelter, Teresa closed her eyes. She was no longer the mansion's shadow. She was Teresa Carter, and her voice, though quiet, was beginning to echo. The old church stood steadfast under a sky streaked with dawn, its weathered walls a quiet haven for those seeking solace. Teresa Carter sat at a worn table in the back room, her notebook open, her pen tracing the edges of her thoughts. The bracelet on her wrist, engraved with light, caught the morning's first rays, a reminder of her mother's enduring presence. Days had passed since she pinned her anonymous letter from the backyard to the church's bulletin board, a raw confession of her years of erasure in the Sinclair mansion. Teresa had poured her grief and defiance into those pages, but she hadn't anticipated their reach. Unbeknownst to her, the letter had escaped the church's quiet confines, carried into the world by a young woman named Maya, whose photograph of the pages now rippled across online forums for domestic workers. Teresa's mornings at the church were filled with purpose, a stark contrast to the relentless servitude of the mansion. She helped Ruth serve breakfast to the women who gathered, tired mothers, weary laborers, their faces etched with stories like hers. The scent of oatmeal and strong coffee filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of shared conversations. Teresa moved among them, her hands steady as she poured juice or folded napkins, her presence a quiet comfort. Ruth watched her with a knowing smile, her eyes gleaming with pride. "You're finding your place," Ruth said one morning, handing Teresa a stack of plates. Teresa nodded, the bracelet glinting as she worked, her heart warmed by the community she was beginning to call home. Outside the church, the world was shifting. Maya's post had sparked a firestorm online, the letter's words resonating, with thousands who saw their own lives reflected in Teresa's pain. A local journalist, Elise, stumbled upon the forum, her curiosity piqued by the letter's raw honesty. Sensing a story, Elise devised a plan to infiltrate the Sinclair household. Posing as a prospective maid, she secured an interview with Evelyn, whose polished exterior masked a brittle arrogance. In the mansion's pristine parlor, surrounded by velvet drapes and gleaming candelabras, Elise recorded Evelyn's words covertly. "I feed them, I house them, and they still whine," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with disdain. "They should be grateful." The words, cold and unyielding, were a damning echo of the cruelty Teresa had endured. When Elise's recording aired on a regional radio show, the response was seismic. Listeners flooded social media with outrage, sharing snippets of the letter alongside Evelyn's words. The Sinclair name, once synonymous with suburban prestige, became a lightning rod for criticism. Evelyn, who had chaired the local school, board and hosted lavish charity galas, faced immediate backlash. The board demanded her resignation, citing reputational damage. Her social circle, once a fortress of influence, began to fracture. Friends canceled invitations, their voices hushed with embarrassment. At school, Lily, Evelyn's daughter, bore the brunt of whispered taunts, her peers echoing the public's scorn. Teresa, unaware of the storm, continued her work at the church, her days filled with small acts of care, her nights with the solace of her notebook. One afternoon, a woman named Helen, a former friend of Evelyn's, arrived at the church, her face pale with unease. Teresa was sorting donated clothes when Helen approached, her hands twisting nervously. "I knew Evelyn," Helen said, her voice low. "I never questioned how she treated you. I should have." She offered a donation to the church's shelter program, her eyes avoiding Teresa's. The gesture, though awkward, was a crack in the facade of the suburb's elite, a sign that Teresa's letter had pierced their complacency. Teresa accepted the donation with a quiet nod, her heart conflicted, grateful for the support, yet wary of its motives. The bracelet on her wrist felt heavier, a reminder to hold fast to her truth. Back at the church, whispers of the letter's impact reached Teresa through Ruth, who scrolled through her phone with wide eyes. "Your words are out there," Ruth said, showing her a post with thousands of shares. Teresa read the comments, her breath catching at the flood of voices. Women who'd cleaned houses, raised others' children, endured slights in silence. "I thought I was alone," one wrote. "This letter is my story too," said another. Teresa's eyes stung, her fingers tracing the bracelet. She hadn't signed the letter, yet it had found its people, amplifying her pain into a chorus of shared truths. As the days unfolded, the scandal grew. A local news outlet published a follow-up, linking Elise's recording to reports of other workers mistreated by the Sinclairs. The story painted a vivid picture of Evelyn's reign, her insistence on bag checks, her dismissive sneers, her refusal to grant Teresa leave for her mother's funeral. Social media buzzed with hashtags, "Letter from the Backyard," trending alongside calls for justice. Teresa, still anonymous, felt the weight of her words reach, though she stayed in the church's quiet embrace, helping women like herself find footing in a world that often overlooked them. One evening, Teresa sat with Ruth under the church's flickering lights, her notebook open. She wrote of the women she'd met, their resilience a mirror to her own. "They're like Mama," she wrote, "strong even when the world tries to break them." Ruth leaned over, her voice soft. "You started something, Teresa. Don't stop now." Teresa looked at the bulletin board where her letter still hung, its edges curling. Maya's act had set it free, and now it was changing lives beyond these walls. Teresa's heart swelled with a mix of fear and pride. She hadn't meant to spark a movement, only to name her pain. Yet the letter had become a beacon, drawing others to share their stories. She thought of Clara, whose songs had taught her to stand tall, and of Sarah, whose diary had urged her to speak. The church, with its creaking pews and warm light, felt like a crucible, forging Teresa into someone new. She closed her notebook, the bracelet gleaming on her wrist. Outside, the world was waking to her truth, but here, in this quiet sanctuary, Teresa felt the first stirrings of power, not loud, not vengeful, but undeniable. The fire she'd lit was spreading, and though she didn't know where it would lead, she knew she'd never be silent again. The old church stood bathed in the soft glow of twilight, its warped steeple casting a jagged shadow across the gravel lot. Inside, Teresa Carter sat at a scarred wooden table, her fingers tracing the edges of her notebook, the bracelet on her wrist glinting with the word light. The air smelled of dust and wax, a quiet comfort that grounded her amidst the storm her words had unleashed. Her anonymous letter from the backyard, born of grief and defiance, had spread far beyond the church's bulletin board, igniting outrage and solidarity across digital spaces. Teresa, still cloaked in anonymity, felt the weight of its impact through the stories of other women who found their voices in hers. Yet, as she helped Ruth serve supper to the shelter's residents, a new challenge arrived, carried in a cream-colored envelope with elegant cursive. Pastor Calvin handed Teresa the letter, his brow furrowed. "It's from her," he said, his voice low as if the words themselves carried a chill. Teresa's heart quickened, recognizing the meticulous script of Evelyn Sinclair. She retreated to the sanctuary's quiet corner, the pews empty save for the echo of hymns long sung. Opening the envelope, she found a single page, its tone as polished as the mansion's marble floors. Evelyn's words were a calculated blend of condescension and urgency. "Your reckless story has tarnished a good family's name. For the sake of our reputation, retract it. You owe us that much for the shelter we provided." The letter ended with a veiled threat. "Refusal will have consequences." Teresa's hands shook, not with fear but with a fury that burned brighter than her grief. She sat in the dim light, the bracelet a steady warmth against her skin. Evelyn's demand was a mirror to the mansion's cruelty, her pain dismissed, her truth reduced to an inconvenience. Teresa thought of her mother, Clara, whose songs had woven strength into her bones, and of Sarah, whose diary had urged her to speak. She wouldn't bend. Taking a fresh page from her notebook, Teresa crafted a response, her pen steady despite the storm in her chest. "Honor isn't built on silence," she wrote, her words sharp and unyielding. "It lives in truth. I owe you nothing." She sealed the letter, entrusting it to Pastor Calvin, who promised to deliver it publicly at the next community gathering. The act felt like a blade drawn, a declaration that Teresa would no longer be invisible. The next day, a package arrived at the church, small and unassuming, wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a child's drawing, 2 stick figures in a garden, their hands clasped under a bright sun. A note scrawled in a young hand read, "I'm sorry, Teresa, I miss you. Lily." Teresa's breath caught, her fingers tracing the crayon lines. It was the picture Evelyn had torn apart, now carefully taped together, sent by Lily through a family friend. The gesture pierced Teresa, a reminder of the girl's quiet kindness amidst her mother's cruelty. She tucked the drawing into her notebook, its presence a bittersweet anchor, proof that her time in the mansion had left a mark, however small. At the church, Teresa's days were filled with purpose. She helped women like herself, maids, nannies, cleaners, write their own stories, their voices forming a chorus of resilience. One woman, Maria, shared how she'd been fired for asking for a day off. Another, Grace, spoke of enduring racial slurs while polishing silver. Teresa listened, her pain mirrored in their words, and encouraged them to write. "Put it down," she said, echoing Ruth's wisdom. "Let it be your power." The women's letters, anonymous like hers, began to fill a box in the church's back room, each a testament to lives unseen. Teresa felt Clara's spirit in these moments, her mother's light shining through the act of bearing witness. The community gathering came on a Sunday, the church packed with locals, their faces a mix of curiosity and solidarity. Pastor Calvin stood at the pulpit, holding Teresa's response to Evelyn. "This is a truth that won't be silenced," he said, his voice resonant. He read her letter aloud, each word landing like a stone in still water. The congregation murmured, some nodding, others wiping tears. Teresa sat in the back, her heart pounding, the bracelet a quiet pulse on her wrist. The public reading was a gauntlet thrown, a challenge to Evelyn's authority. Whispers spread that the Sinclair name was crumbling. Business deals faltered. Social invitations dried up, and Evelyn's carefully curated image unraveled. Outside the church, the fallout grew. Lily's drawing, shared by the family friend on social media, became a viral symbol of the scandal, its taped edges a poignant contrast to Evelyn's cold dismissal. Bloggers and activists linked it to Teresa's letter, speculating about the boss, Maid who'd sparked a reckoning. Teresa, still anonymous, watched from the sidelines, her notebook filling with new entries. "Lily saw me," she wrote, even when her mother wouldn't. The drawing stirred something in her, a hope that truth could reach even those within the mansion's walls. Ruth sat with Teresa one evening, her eyes bright with pride. "You've shaken their world," she said, gesturing to her phone, where comments on the letter multiplied. "They're listening now." Teresa read a message from a woman in another state. "Your letter gave me courage to leave." Her eyes stung, the bracelet a steady reminder of her mother's strength. She wasn't alone anymore. Her words had built a bridge to others. As the week closed, Teresa stood by the bulletin board, where her letter still hung, now joined by others from the women she'd helped. The church, with its creaking pews and warm light, felt like a crucible, forging her grief into purpose. She thought of Lily, clutching that drawing, and of Evelyn, facing the consequences of her words. Teresa's response had been a quiet rebellion, but its echo was loud. She wrote in her notebook, "Mama said I'm light, I'm shining now and they can't look away." The church's walls seemed to hum with her resolve, a promise that her voice, once a whisper, would grow louder still. The old church glowed softly under a dawn sky, its windows catching the first light like stained glass prayers. Teresa Carter stood in the cramped room she now called home, her duffel bag packed with care. The bracelet on her wrist, etched with light, gleamed as she tucked her mother's photograph and Mr. Chubby, the worn teddy bear, beside her notebook. The invitation from the National Domestic Workers Alliance lay on the cot, its embossed seal a summons to a world far beyond the church's quiet embrace. They wanted Teresa to speak at their conference in the capital, to share her story, not as an anonymous letter, but as herself. Her heart fluttered with both dread and resolve, the weight of her words now a beacon others followed. Teresa hesitated, her fingers tracing the bracelet's inscription. The thought of standing before strangers her pain laid bare felt like stepping into a storm, but Ruth's voice echoed in her mind. "Your words are powerful." Pastor Calvin's encouragement, steady and warm, urged her forward. "Your voice is light." And Clara's memory, woven into every folk song she'd ever sung, whispered, "Don't let them dim you." Teresa folded the invitation into her pocket, her decision made. She would go, not for fame, but for the women whose stories mirrored hers, for the promise she'd made at her mother's grave. The train station was a quiet hum of early morning travelers, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Teresa boarded the first train, her bag at her feet, the bracelet a steady pulse against her skin. The landscape blurred past, fields giving way to towns, then to the steel and glass of the capital. She clutched Mr. Chubby, its matted fur, a reminder of Lily's small kindness, and opened her notebook, reading the words she'd written in the church's dim light. "I'm not their shadow," she'd scrawled. "I'm Teresa Carter." The word steadied her, a mantra for the journey ahead. The capital was a whirlwind of noise and motion, its towering buildings glinting under a restless sky. Teresa moved through the crowds, her soft gray dress pressed by Marla the night before, flowing like a quiet rebellion against the city's clamor. The conference center loomed ahead, its banners bold with words: dignity, voice, justice. Inside, the air buzzed with purpose, activists, workers, policymakers mingling in a sea of shared resolve. A young assistant, clipboard in hand, greeted Teresa with nervous reverence. "We're honored you're here," she said, her voice trembling. Teresa smiled, her nerves easing. "I'm honored too," she replied, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. Backstage, Teresa waited, the murmur of the crowd filtering through the heavy curtain. The speaker before her, a labor organizer, spoke of wage theft and the unseen work that propped up wealth. Applause rippled, and then the announcer's voice rang out, "Teresa Carter." Her heart pounded, but she stepped forward, the bracelet glinting as she adjusted the microphone. The room fell hushed. Hundreds of faces turned toward her, expectant, open, waiting. "I was a maid for 3 years," Teresa began, her voice clear, unhurried. "In a house where my name was a burden, my grief an inconvenience, my existence a shadow." The words flowed, each one a stone laid on a path she'd carved from pain. Teresa spoke of the mansion's cold elegance, of the laughter that mocked her mother's death, of the trash bags that held her life. She described the church, the women whose stories echoed hers, and the letter that had become their voice. "I stayed silent because I thought it kept me safe," she said, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "I was wrong. Silence only served those who needed me small." A woman. In the front row, her chin trembling, nodded fiercely. Teresa's voice grew stronger. "When they told me my mother's funeral didn't matter, I learned I was never invisible. They just refused to see me." For 20 minutes, Teresa wove her story, her words a tapestry of loss and resilience. She spoke of Clara's songs, of Ruth's wisdom, of the drawing Lily sent, taped together like a fragile hope. The audience leaned in, some wiping tears, others clenching fists. When she finished, the room rose in silence, a reverence deeper than applause. Then the clapping came, a tide of recognition that washed over her. Teresa stepped back, her heart full, the bracelet a quiet fire on her wrist. Afterward, people lined up to speak to her. A young woman, her voice shaking, approached. "I work for a family like that," she whispered. "I thought I had no choice." Teresa took her hand, her grip firm. "You always have a choice," she said, her eyes steady. Another woman, older, hugged her, murmuring, "Me too." A third simply said, "Thank you," her voice thick with gratitude. Teresa listened, her presence a quiet anchor, her words a spark that lit their own. The train ride home was serene, the sun setting in golden streaks across the windows. Teresa sat by the glass, Mr. Chubby in her lap, her notebook open. She wrote of the women she'd met, their courage a mirror to her own. "I spoke today," she scrawled, "and they heard me." The bracelet caught the fading light, its inscription a promise kept. Marla met her at the station, a thermos of ginger tea in hand, her smile saying everything words couldn't. Teresa hugged her, the weight of the day settling into peace. Back at the church, life resumed its quiet rhythm. Teresa sorted donations, poured coffee, and listened to the women's stories. But something had shifted. The residents looked at her with new eyes, not awe, but recognition, as if they saw their strength reflected in her. She was no longer just a helper. She was proof that a voice could break through silence. As she lay on her cot that night, the church's walls humming with the soft sounds of refuge, Teresa felt Clara's presence, her mother's light shining through her. She had stepped into the storm and emerged whole, her voice no longer a whisper, but a call that echoed far beyond the capital's halls. The old church exhaled a quiet warmth as dawn crept through its cracked windows, painting the worn pews in hues of amber. Teresa Carter stood in the small office of the Women's Support Center, a modest brick building tucked behind the church. Her new role as a coordinator filled her days with purpose, a far cry from the endless scrubbing of the Sinclair mansion. The bracelet on her wrist, etched with light, gleamed softly as she sorted intake forms, her fingers steady with the weight of others' stories. The air smelled of fresh coffee and hope, a sanctuary for women whose lives, like hers, had been shaped by unseen labor. Teresa, now 29, had found her place, not in servitude but in strength. Her mornings began with small acts of care, guiding a trembling mother through housing applications, listening to a young maid recount years of slights, offering a nod that said, "I see you." The women called her Miss Teresa, a title that carried respect, not diminishment. She moved among them with quiet authority, her presence a beacon for those navigating their shadows. One woman, Clara, name, by chance like Teresa's mother, arrived with a bruised cheek and 2 children clinging to her skirt. Teresa sat with her, offering tea in silence until Clara whispered, "I didn't think anyone would care." Teresa's hand found hers, the bracelet catching the light. "We care," she said, her voice firm, and Clara's shoulders eased, a weight lifted by being seen. The center buzzed with life, children's laughter, the rustle of paperwork, the soft hum of shared dreams. Teresa's office, a cramped space with a desk and a single window, held her notebook, now filled with entries of resilience. She wrote of the women she helped, their courage a mirror to her journey. "They're building new lives," she penned, "and I'm learning to build mine." The teddy bear, Mr. Chubby, sat on a shelf, its matted fur a reminder of Lily's kindness, a thread connecting her past to this new chapter. One afternoon, Teresa stood before the Sinclair mansion, its iron gates as imposing as ever. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. She held Mr. Chubby, its weight a quiet farewell to the life she'd left behind. Without a word, she placed the bear at the gate, its small form a silent testament to her departure. She didn't linger, turning away as the mansion loomed, its grandeur hollow. Inside, Evelyn Sinclair found the bear, her fingers tightening around it. The house, once alive with her command, was now a cold shell. Friends gone, influence faded, her daughter's silence a wound she couldn't name. Evelyn's grip faltered, her solitude a mirror to the emptiness she'd sown. Back at the center, a letter arrived, its childish scrawl unmistakable. Lily, now a little older, had written, "I'm sorry for what Mama did. I miss your stories." The words stung, a reminder of the girl trapped in Evelyn's world. Teresa folded the letter into her notebook, choosing not to reply. Some bridges, she knew, were best left uncrossed, but she hoped Lily would find her light someday. The bracelet warmed her wrist, Clara's spirit a steady guide as she returned to her work, filing papers and brewing tea, each act a stitch in a new tapestry. Teresa's evenings were her own, a luxury she'd never known in the mansion. She walked the town's quiet streets, the air sharp with the promise of winter. At the church, she tended a small herb garden, planting sage in memory of Clara's kitchen. On Sundays, she cooked for Marla's family, the scent of cornbread finally perfected, filling the house with warmth. Her notebook grew heavy with stories, not just her own, but those of the women she served. "We're standing together," she wrote, her pen steady. The center was her anchor, its walls echoing with laughter and resolve. One morning, a new client arrived, Lila, a young maid with eyes full of fear. "My boss says I'm lucky to have a job," Lila said, her voice trembling, "but I feel like nothing." Teresa leaned forward, her gaze steady. "You're not nothing," she said, the bracelet glinting. "You're enough." She handed Lila a pen and paper, urging her to write her truth, just as Ruth had once urged her. Lila's hesitant words joined the growing collection, a chorus, of voices breaking through the silence. Teresa's heart swelled, her mother's light shining through every woman she helped rise. As weeks passed, the center became a hub of change. Women left abusive jobs, found apartments, and learned to see their worth. Teresa's role grew, her confidence a quiet fire. She no longer measured herself by the mansion's demands, but by the trust in the eyes of those she served. One evening, she sat on the church's porch, the stars bright above. Her notebook lay open, its final entry a vow. I was invisible once, now I'm seen. I was silent once, now I speak. She closed it, the bracelet a soft weight, her mother's voice, a song in her heart. Teresa stood, the night air cool against her skin. The church, with its leaning steeple and warm light, was her foundation, but her work at the center was her future. She thought of Clara, of Sarah, of Lily's taped-together drawing, each a thread in her story. The Sinclair mansion was a fading shadow, its gates unable to hold her back. Teresa was Miss Teresa now, a woman who listened, who lifted, who shone. Her light, kindled in grief, had grown into a flame that warmed others, a legacy of standing tall. Thank you for joining us on Teresa Carter's powerful journey in The Letter from the Backyard. Her story of resilience, from silent servitude to a voice that sparked change, reminds us of the strength found in truth. We hope it moved you as much as it did us. What resonated with you most? Was it Teresa's quiet rebellion, her letter's ripple effect, or her unwavering light? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your reflections and where you're listening from. Your voice matters, just like Teresa's. If this story touched you, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of courage and subscribe to stay connected. Thank you for being part of this journey, for listening, and for carrying these stories forward. Until next time, keep shining your light and we'll meet again soon with another story that speaks to the heart.